Hi. Some of you may know me, some of you may know of me. My name is Shie. I'm a composer and music editor. I've been in LA for a little over 20 years. I've been very fortunate to have worked on a lot of projects. I think I've got over 100 movies under my belt, and I don't know how many hours of TV. Probably best known as a music editor rather than as a composer, but I do both, and I enjoy both. I try not to suck at both. So I've been asked to talk about a few things, so I'll start with the first one in no particular order other than that's the first one I was asked to talk about, which was my approach to scoring and to music editing, which is essentially the same. We're storytellers. So to me, it's all about story. And that's what matters. How do you tell the story? And to me, good filmmaking is all about having the least amount of stuff necessary to tell the best possible story. So to me, if you do too much, and it doesn't matter if it's a scene, it could be with the editing. A scene goes on for too long, or somebody's overacting too much in the background, the set design is overdone, whatever it is, if there's too much of it, there's too much of it. So I'm a big believer that you just want to do what you need to do to make it the best it can be. No more, no less. So I approach music the same way. I don't want to overscore anything. I want to put in the least amount of music that is necessary to help tell a better story and help make it better and help propel it forward. But not too little, not too much. It's all about finding that balance. And there's no right answer. There's no objective answer to that. It's all about the style, and it's a collaboration. It's working with the filmmaker and figuring out what is his or her style. What do they like? Some people like a much more minimal approach, and the way they shoot, the way they direct, the way everything is more sort of minimal. Other people, Michael Bay, it's like it's more and more and more and more, which works for that kind of a thing. A Michael Bay movie is completely different than a little intimate indie film festival darling, like a Juno or something like that. Do you know what I mean? It's not right or wrong. It's finding what's right for that project. That said, I tend to overscore, or if I'm temping, I tend to over temp, because I would rather over deliver, give more than they need, and then pull stuff out and not use it, than be in a situation like I was 15 minutes ago, where I got an email from a producer saying, hey, we need to add something here. And now I'm scrambling to quickly cut a new cue and create something for a moment because it was never done. So I tend to overdo it and then take stuff out. One of my favorite examples is I worked on this film called Jasmine a few years ago that I scored. Wonderful first-time director, Dax Phelan, who was awesome. And when we started talking about the film, it was supposed to be very minimal, very little score. And as I started scoring it, he kept asking for more and more and more and more, to the point where I found myself arguing with him and going, no, Zach, you don't need music here. Dax, you don't need music here. And he's like, yeah, I need more music. And I had over 70 minutes of music in this film. Once he got sound design and everything and went into the mix, about half of it got pulled back out and gotten rid of, and it wasn't necessary. But I was happy to give him, it's like I would argue why we maybe don't need something. And sometimes I just knew you just don't need it. But he wasn't there. He needed to go through the journey. So I'd rather over deliver and then have it not used. I don't think it's a waste of time. Another thing that sometimes happens is I'll deliver something, and it doesn't matter if it's temp or original, and a director might not be sure about it. And so they're like, well, can we try this? So you try that, and they're like, well, what about this? And you go around and around and around, and you try sometimes a handful of versions, sometimes a dozen versions, whatever, only to end up back where you started with the very first version. And I've had directors repeatedly apologize to me. It's like, well, I'm so sorry I made you do all of that only to come back. You were right the first time. It's not a waste. There's nothing to apologize for. Sometimes you have to take the journey in order to know that you were in the right place to begin with. You know, it's the only way to know sometimes. You know, if you're unsure, if it's tricky, if you have questions, if you have other ideas. So I'm a big fan of exploring, trying things. There's no harm in trying stuff. And if it doesn't work, you know, one of my expertise is Command M for mute, you know, just really good at muting stuff. It's really easy. So that's kind of, I guess, my general approach to film scoring. You know, it's like end up with the least amount necessary to tell the story, and always let the story be inform what you're doing. Let the story lead. Music shouldn't lead, it should follow, or it should go along with, but it shouldn't be ahead of the story. There are times where you want to use music to foreshadow something. But that's part of the storytelling. We use that, you know, writers use that in their writing style and whatever, but it should only foreshadow if it makes sense to foreshadow. But generally speaking, you don't want to get ahead of the story. You don't want to give it away. You don't want to diminish what's coming, you know, lessen the impact. So yeah, any questions, anybody, any thoughts, anything? Nothing? It's really weird with everybody muted, which I appreciate, but I have like 0 feedback, so it's very bizarre. First time doing this. All right, so I was asked to talk a little bit about differences between working on big budget studio films and low budget films. Well, the obvious big difference is the paycheck. The big budget ones pay a lot better, which is nice. I think in terms of approach and all of that, it's exactly the same. What's the story? What's the need? When you're working with a big budget studio film, sort of the sky's the limit. So if you say, you know, I want to record 12 bagpipes, I want to sample a sheep and turn it into an instrument and get a 50 people kazoo choir or whatever crazy thing you want. When they have money, you can come up with anything and do anything, and do some really crazy stuff. Or you can just say, yeah, I do need that 100-piece orchestra or whatever it is. And, you know, 2 months later, you're at Sony recording a 100+ piece orchestra, and it's awesome and it's amazing. And when you say, hey, we need to bring in another person because we need help, we need this, we need that, the answer is usually yes. And it's sort of whatever you need, all hands on deck. And in that regard, it's fantastic. But there's actually something about having limits that I love, and about working on smaller budgets where you're forced to come up with creative solutions. So I talked about this film Jasmine earlier. When I first talked to Dax, he referenced There Will Be Blood, and he wanted this aleatoric, weird, sound effecty orchestral score with a bit of synth. And I was like, what's the budget? And there was no budget. And I'm like, well, the only way to do that is to find existing sound libraries and press a button and layer things. And that didn't interest me one bit. That doesn't feel like composing to me. So we had a conversation. I said, well, I could do that, but I don't want to do that. And I don't think it'll sound that great. or let me think about it and find a different way. And we ended up going with a completely electronic score, a completely different direction that emotionally did all of those things, but it pushed me in a direction that I never would have gone if I didn't have limitations. There's other great examples of it. Napoleon Dynamite, which John Swihart scored, friend of mine, he came up with that idea of making it all sound like it's coming out of that little keyboard in this very small sounding, raw sounding thing, in no small part simply because they had no money. So he had to find a clever way to deal with it. It was also one of his first films. He didn't have a ton of gear or a ton of experience. He had ingenuity. So sometimes limitations, lack of budget, are a wonderful thing because they push us to find really creative solutions. We're seeing it now with people starting to use remote recording, not just for sweetening, but to do much bigger projects and entire orchestras. Like Phil Eisler just did the final episode of, I think it was the final episode or one of the last episodes of Empire, and he was able to pull it together with remote. So it pushes people in different directions, and as we try different things and get pushed in different directions, it's like one thing leads to the next, leads to the next. So I kind of like that part of indie filmmaking and limited budgets. The constraints force me to get more creative. It can also be frustrating because sometimes on a bigger feature film, the schedules tend to be very, very busy. And even though we have however many weeks we have, there is so much to do. And the level of detail is so extreme that you're just slammed from morning till night. Where on an indie film, they might not have the money and the schedule's a little looser and it's stretched out over a longer period of time because just get it done when you get it done, as long as we meet a deadline. And that can sometimes make me drag my feet. A deadline is good for me. I'm the kind of personality that I need a deadline, so it helps me. And I have found myself more than once, I hate to admit, just dragging my feet because there was no deadline, or there's no budget and there's no daily thing. It's just, we need this by Tuesday. And I know it's a day and a half worth of work. And so I won't get started on it until, like Sunday afternoon or something. It's like, I tend to sadly procrastinate, and it's when I hit that wall, then it magically happens. I don't know why. I'm not recommending it. But that's one of the differences, where on a big budget film, you're on the film and you're on it full time every day. Also with smaller indies, often you're juggling 2 or 3 things. And I don't love that part of it, actually. I prefer to focus on one thing at a time. I prefer to be 100% on one project, and then 100% on the next. But when the money's not there and the schedules are all over the place and you got bills to pay, you got to take sometimes 2 or 3 projects at the same time and juggle. So I've had days where, I'll spend a couple hours in the morning taking care of tasks on project A, and then I'll spend the afternoon on project B, and then in the evening I'm scoring a short film or something, or stuff like that. It's kind of exciting to have the change and the variety, but for me, I tend to keep everything in my head, even though I write everything down and I have my spotting notes and I have my lists and everything. I can't let go of it. It all has to sit in my head for some reason. So for me, when I've got 2 or 3 projects going on at once, it's a lot in my head at once, and it's all competing for attention. So like when I'm working on a big budget project, at the end of the day, I'll go to bed and I find that I can turn myself, kind of switch off and go to bed relatively easily. Where when I'm working on multiple things, my brain's like, did you miss something on A? Did you miss something on B? Did you do that thing for C? Do you know what I mean? So those are some of the differences. But in terms of the process, it's essentially the same. You know, you spot the movie, you discuss the needs, you follow the story, you create a temp. On a big budget, I might have 2 or 3 weeks to create a temp, where on a small budget, I might have 4 days. So, you know, in 4 days, I'm slapping things together, and the first thing I find that's kind of sort of close goes in. On a big budget, we'll keep finessing it and tweaking it. And, you know, like the temps on those types of moves are really, really detailed, and pretty impressive. And you can really, you have the time to spend, and it's important to them because they'll do test screenings. Excuse me. Sorry. You know, they'll do big test screenings and things like that. So the level of detail can be more intense on big budget movies. But you know, recording 100-piece orchestra versus a string quartet, for me, is no different. It might be different for your engineer. It might be a different studio, different mics, different, you know, technically. But as a music editor or as a composer, it's no different at all, because you still have to write it. Or if you're the music editor, you're still working with the composer to make sure everything that needs to be ready for the session is ready for the session. You're still ticking all the boxes. You're still doing all your checklists. You're still coordinating with orchestrators, with mixers, with studios, whatever. And on a big film, those might all be different people. On a small film, you might be the orchestrator and the music prep, and you might be doing a remote recording, so you're checking in with the individuals rather than with an engineer or with a contractor. But it's the same thing. It's still, the music still needs to be written. It still needs to be prepared. You still need to have your list. You still need to come up with a recording order. You still need to make sure everything gets done properly. You still need to receive the materials, cut them in, build the sessions. All of that is exactly the same. So any questions on that? Michael? Unmute yourself. Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So specifically, I'm a little vague on what your responsibilities are as an editor, as distinct from a composer. You say you work with the composer, so you're basically producing.
Well, that could be a whole seminar unto itself, but I'll try to give you a quick overview. Music editors can do a lot of different things, and we're often servants of two masters, or not often, always, pretty much, because you're working with a composer, but you're also working for the production, and you're getting paid by the production. So your bosses are the director and the producer, but also the composer. And when everybody's on the same page and it's all working great, that's fantastic. But sometimes they're at odds, and it can get tricky because the director or the producers might want one thing while the composer has a different idea. Or I've been in situations where directors have a direction and a vision, and the producers have a different vision, and it can get interesting. And I won't get into the politics of that right now. But as a music editor, a lot of times I get brought in before they even have a composer, and I am asked to create a temp score, which literally means find existing music, and I am limited to all the music that's ever been created and recorded in the history of mankind. It's kind of overwhelming. Just grab anything you want and cut it in lieu of original score, so that they have something, so that they can get a sense. And a lot of times, especially early on when they don't have a composer yet, the music editor has a huge, huge, huge impact on how the film will be scored. Because if a director says, I don't know what I need, just find me something, do something, which happens. Sometimes they really don't know what they want. They just want it to work. Now it's up to me to pick a direction. Well, am I going to go orchestral, and am I going to go electronic? Am I going to go big? Am I going to go small? Am I going to go hybrid? Am I going to go indie quirky? Like the choices are endless. And you start trying things, and you place the music, and you get a sound, and you get a vibe, and you're spotting the movie as you go, because you're making choices of where to put music, where not to put music, and then you go back and forth with the director. But that essentially becomes the blueprint for when they bring on a composer.
So at
And
that point,
sorry, go ahead.
at that point, those are pretty much. You might say to him, "We need something in an electronica style or a symphonic style, or specifically this." At that point, it's really not that creative decision, or certain creative decisions have already been made.
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, if the music editor is on before they've even locked a composer, they don't know who they want. I've been on shows where I'm brought in, I do a temp, and then once they start getting a feel for the temp and they're like, this is working for me, this is good, um, then they start thinking, okay, well, which composers would be appropriate to do something along these lines? I've been on shows where I've temped with the music of friends of mine who I thought it worked, and I thought it would be great, and I thought they would be great for it. And guess who ended up getting hired for the job? The persons whose music was all over the temp. So I've literally gotten people jobs on occasion. Um, so yeah, when you're brought in early and they don't have a composer in mind yet, you have a huge impact on the way the score is going to end up. And sadly, sometimes too much, because sometimes they get married to the temp, as they say, and then they go to the composer and are like, copy that. And I absolutely hate, 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 hate that with a passion. So my take on temping, because I'm also a composer and I love composers and I respect composers, is I try to make a temp that's good enough as a blueprint, but not so good that they're going to fall in love with it and want somebody to copy it. I want to make it so that the composer can beat it, which I think sometimes makes things harder for myself than they need to be. Because, but I remember working on a score once, on a temp on a movie, and there was this beautiful love scene, and I just knew there's this cue from Big Fish that Danny Elfman wrote, that I just knew that that cue is magic. It's killer. It's awesome. But we didn't have a budget for a big orchestra or anything, and uh, I didn't know the composer that well, and he was far less experienced. I was very hesitant to put that in, um, because I didn't want to, like make it harder for the composer or trip him up. But since I knew who the composer was, he was already on board, and we had started building a relationship. I simply picked up the phone and I'm like, hey, dude, do you know that cue for that movie Big Fish, for that movie? He's like, yeah, that's a great cue. I'm like, what do you think about that for this section? He's like, oh my God, that would be perfect. I'm like, and you're okay with me putting that in the temp? He's like, oh yeah, by all means. I love a challenge. Okay, so I put it in. But sadly, I've also been in situations where when I'm on a final dub, especially on smaller budget movies, um, and the director's like, why is the music, I remember it being better and bigger or whatever. Usually it's with big, and this hasn't happened as much lately. It used to happen earlier when samples weren't quite where they are today, and making stuff sound really big and epic with samples wasn't as successful as it is today. And I literally had a director referencing the temp, and he thought the temp was his, and it wasn't. And he wasn't as happy with the final result as he was with the temp. That's horrible. That's tragic. Nobody wants that, you know? So I always try to think in those terms. When I start a project as a music editor and they ask me to temp, the first questions I ask are, what's the budget? Is there a composer already attached to the project? Because if if they hire, I don't know, a Paul Haslinger, for example, who's known for doing very electronic and hybrid electronic things, and they say, we're hiring Paul Haslinger, and it's a $50,000 package deal, which I don't know if Paul does those deals anymore, but I'm not going to temp it with John Williams. I'm not going to temp it with massive Danny Elfman scores or things like that, because we're never going to be able to do that. It doesn't make sense. So I try to be very conscious of stuff like that. And then, so that's one of the big roles of a music editor, which is initially the temp. You're also often, you end up being sort of the liaison between the director or the producers and the composer, because often, especially on big budget feature films, there's a cutting room for you. You're literally in an office on the lot or wherever they're cutting. You have an office on location at Warner Brothers, Universal, or wherever. And you're right next door, and you're seeing the picture editor and the director and the producers practically every day, and they're popping into your office with requests and things all the time. And so often these things will come up, and then you're like picking up the phone to the composer and going, hey, Penka, hi, Penka. You go, hey, Penka, so the director just came into my office and we just did this thing. I'm going to send you a quick time, add that to your list. So oftentimes you become the liaison rather than having a direct conversation, because it's just more practical and it's easier for them. The other part, when you're working with composers, there's a lot you can do to help the composer. So everything from creating spotting notes to updating spotting notes every time a new picture comes in, and you have to update and conform and not just update them, but go, oh, I know you've already done this cue. You need to lose 2 seconds and 12 frames right around bar 50. That's super helpful, because then they're like, oh, I don't have to figure out. I can just jump to here. I know exactly where the fix is, and they just have to figure out how to do that fix. I have composers, they're like, yeah, I don't care. I already wrote it to the old picture. We're going to record it to the old picture. You're going to fix it. So I have composers that work like that. I have composers that like to update everything to the latest picture possible before scoring. And they have, again, me do that. They don't do it. So I'll update everything. And often it involves phone calls with orchestrators saying, hey, over here, I need you to do this. And in order to make this, we can do this cut, but can you make the horns hang over a little bit longer to help smooth it out? Maybe let's bring the strings in a beat earlier. You can have conversations that go beyond just hard editing, but actually, how do you make it musical? And I have composers that they don't hear their conformed music until it hits the stage. And they're sitting there and they're going, yep, okay. Or sometimes they're like, ooh, that didn't quite work, and they'll make a change on the spot. I have other composers that do it all themselves, or they have an assistant that does all of that kind of stuff for them. So it's very different depending on the relationship, the composer, the needs. Then you're there. Yes, Penka. Unmute.
Shie, finish your thought. And how are you doing? This is fantastic. Thank you so much. Finish your thought. And I have a very specific question that totally will segue from exactly what you're describing right now. So when you finish, I wanted to ask it.
Now I have to remember what I was talking about. So I was saying different composers do it different ways. And then regardless of how it's done, it's usually my responsibility to make sure that I have proper lists of everything that needs to be recorded at every session. And I will often work with the orchestrator to determine what's the best recording order. I recently finished working with Pinar Toprak on Stargirl. I essentially became the de facto sort of score producer, for lack of a better term, where everything would end up in my lap. I would get all the music, and it was up to me to figure out the record order and how we do it. And I would talk to the contractors and work on scheduling the sessions and all of that, so that because I knew what the schedules were in terms of mix and when we need stuff going. And with a series, there's ongoing mixes and the schedule kept changing. So I could talk to the contractor and say, hey, you know what? We don't have a mix for 3 weeks, and we have 2 episodes that are already done. So instead of doing each one separately, we're going to try to squeeze in a 3rd episode, and then we can do 3 episodes in 2 days instead of 1 episode a day. And we can be more efficient about it and get more done for less money, save some money, which we were then able to save and do a finale with a bigger orchestra in a bigger room, for example. So in that case, I was in charge of all of that and helping facilitate stuff like that. I've done stuff like that for other composers. I did a project for Danny Elfman, I remember years ago, called Deep Sea 3D. And I worked with the orchestrators and stuff to figure out what's what. And just by rearranging the order of things, we're able to save almost $20,000 off of the proposed budget, which was over budget, because I was like, you don't need an A, like they planned for an A orchestra and a B orchestra, and we figured out actually we can have an A orchestra, B orchestra, C orchestra, and D orchestra, getting progressively smaller. And just by scheduling things in a smart way and doing a smart record order, we could work with smaller and smaller orchestras per session, which meant less musicians, save money. So sometimes you're involved with stuff like that. And then you're the one that gets all the recordings, builds a session to send to the mix. So you want to talk to the mixer and make sure everything from technical things like what frame rate are we at, what sample rate, what bit rate, so just technical stuff like that, to how many tracks are you expecting from me, you know? How many tracks can you accept? Or is this a completely separate session, or are you importing my tracks into your session? All these kinds of conversations. You have conversations that involve the mixer, that involve the composer, that involve the director, and it's your job to really pay attention. And sometimes on the scoring stage, during scoring, a director might go, ooh, yeah, I kind of like this, but I'm not sure, you know, can I play with it in the mix? And so that's where you jump in and you're like, well, they're all in the room together, so let's do a separate pass and separate it so we can have it as a separate stem in the mix. Or it might already be stemmed out, so you're like, yep, we can do that easy. But then you're making a note and making sure that the mixer knows when they print their final mix stems, make sure this element is separate so I have control over it. So you're paying attention to stuff like that. You're building the sessions. If picture changes again, you're conforming the sessions after it's already been recorded. You're at the dub stage, and at the dub stage, you're the composer's representative. So you're the person that's there to, in many ways, protect their music from total butchery. Because often you'll get people going, yeah, can we just mute the trumpets here? I don't mean to pick on trumpets, but it's just an easy example. And the answer might be yes, but I never say yes. I'll always go, what's the problem with the trumpets? And they're like, well, they're stepping all over the dialogue. I'm like, oh, but if you mute them, it completely castrates this moment and it completely minimizes the moment. Let me do an edit, because this has to do with a conform and a change. Let me do an edit and move them so they're just before the line or just after the line. So you still have the impact of the cue. You still have the strength. It's still working, but they're no longer stepping on the line. Sometimes a director will just say, well, because I just don't like them. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, mute. But I always try to find out, not take their notes too literally, and find out what are they really asking for. Does that make sense? So that's part of the job, and it's part of how do you best tell the story and make the music be more effective, but B, also respect the music and protect the music and protect the composer. They're no longer there. I'm often giving suggestions, giving feedback. This needs to be a little bit louder. Ooh, this is a little bit boomy. Can we EQ it a little bit? Things like that. I'm there to help the music mixers. So in terms of layout, in terms of reaching for stuff, Sometimes they're sitting and there's a ton of tracks, and a director will say, you know, that moment there, and there's that sound that does this thing. I know the score inside out. I know where everything is, and I'll jump in and quickly find it and go, hey, Gary, that's track 12. Oh, thanks, pal. Boom. They know exactly where to go, instead of starting to mute things or solo things to try to find it. So you help speed the process along. And then when all is said and done, you're dealing with deliverables to get all the materials to the studio, all the stuff that they need. You do the cue sheets so that everybody gets paid their royalties when eventually it generates royalties and stuff like that. So I think that's kind of the end of my overview on music editing. So Penka, you had a specific question.
Oh, thank you so much. I've been waiting to ask this question of you because you're the total pro. So imagine a scenario where a composer is scoring a low budget film and they cannot hire brilliant music editor. And basically they have to do the conforming. So imagine the scenario where the film is cut a couple of times and the composer received, let's say, 4 cuts or 5 cuts. So what is the best practice? I can explain to you what I've been doing for 20 years, but I always felt like there must be a better way. Like, for instance, when I get edit 1 or edit 2, I would always, in the markers for each cue, I would mark the cuts, especially, not every single cut, but especially the important cuts, like the really visible cuts from one scene to the next scene, or from a close-up to extremely long shot, that are very distinguishable, easily distinguishable. So when the next edit of the picture comes to me, I would load the same scene and I would now go to my cuts and see where they have changed. And that is very tedious, maybe because I don't do it fluently, so I kind of take a long time. Then I have to mark up the time codes on the sheet. So what is the best practice that you guys do to do precisely that, conform, but within the sequence? Because I'm talking about, like, the sequence is loaded, the music is loaded.
I understand. So
the cuts change. So
I don't know if this is the best practice, but this is how I do it.
Okay.
And it's different if I'm composing or editing, or correction. It's not different so much if I'm composing or editing. It's different if the audio's already been recorded and I'm cutting audio, versus if it hasn't been recorded yet, or if it's a MIDI score and it hasn't been finalized yet, and I'm doing the work in my DAW, in my sequencer.
Let's say during the composing, during the process of composing in the DAW.
During the process of composers, because I've done this both for myself and for others, because most of the films, or all of the film that I've scored, I've never had a music editor. It's always, I'm everything. I have the benefit of also being a music editor, so it makes that part easier. I generally don't use markers that much in my writing, because I don't know why. I just don't. But the first thing I would say is I don't chase picture like a maniac. I write to what I write. I move forward. When new picture comes, I'll switch to that picture. I'll update my spotting notes, and that's just tedious. You just have to find, oh, this frame that used to be at this time code is now at that time code. I can show you how I do it in Pro Tools, which for doing notes, I always do it in Pro Tools because I find that to be the easiest. So I'll update my notes for myself. And then I'll just keep writing new cues to the newer picture. And if there's a 3rd version or a 4th version or whatever, I just keep moving forward, always to the newest version. But I never go back to update things until we're done. And then when we're done, we're like, here's locked picture, or here's the version we're recording to, if we're going to record, or here's the delivery version, you know, when essentially I'm done. Then I go back and I'll update. So some cues might go from version 1 to version 4. Some cues might go from version 3 to version 4. Other cues might have been written on version 4. Does that make sense? So the first thing is I don't chase picture every time it comes. I don't worry about it. I deal with it at the end. And to give you some extreme examples, when I worked on Hellboy 2 for Danny Elfman, he wrote things on versions 1, if memory serves, it was versions 1 through 5 or 6, something like that. I think it was versions 1 through 6. Then we conformed everything to version 6 and went to the dub stage. to the scoring stage, and we were recording at Abbey Road to version 6. Halfway through the recording, we got a version 7. And there were a couple of cues that we had to quickly actually change because the difference was very big. We had one cue that used to be a song, and now suddenly it's a cue, and we had to create something. There was another one where something got completely taken out, and we had to connect things that weren't connected before. So how do you create the connective tissue? Easier to do it compositionally than editorially. So we decided to make those changes and record them that way. But by the time we were done, I think the picture versions were somewhere around version 30 to 32, 33. And all of that was done after everything was recorded. That was all me cutting audio. And I think all but 3 cues in that movie got hit and had anywhere from minor to major surgery. It was kind of nuts, but it's not that unusual on big films. Where on smaller films, smaller budget films, often you might have 2 or 3 versions before it's locked and that's it, or you just get locked picture. So a little aside there. But the way I'll do it in my sequencer, rather than doing markers, I'll figure out where was the change. So I'll show you in Pro Tools how I do it and how I mark up my changes for my spottiness. But in my notes, I'll give myself a note, like at this time code, they lost X amount. So then when I go to my sequence, I can go to that time code and I'm like, oh, that's at bar 40. And that's equal to, and I just play and I'll go, that's about 2 beats. It's about 5 beats. It's about whatever it is, a beat and a half. And then I'm just like, okay, well, if I need to add a beat and a half here, how would I do it? If I need to take out a few beats here, how would I do it? And the nice thing is that usually you can do a couple of cuts and then a little tempo tweak and you're done. So one of the things that people asked me about was conforming to picture changes. So I actually have something ready to go to show you guys. So I will do this. Hey, look at that, so many screens. And hopefully you can see, I put Pro Tools on the big screen. Hopefully you guys can kind of sort of see that. But what I will do is I will bring in the old picture. So this is the old version. And these are the guide tracks. And then here are the mock-ups that the composer sent me. Is everybody able to see that? Okay. And then I import the new picture and all the guide tracks. And the beautiful thing about guide tracks is that they provide a really easy, quick way to see where things are different. So for example, I could just kind of zoom a little bit here and you can see that this no longer lines up. There's a difference there. So I can find that difference very quickly. I can just zoom in. I go into grid mode and I'm on frames. My grid is single frames. So there's that sound, right? And now I'll go over here and there's that sound again. And so now I know that, whoops, they took out 3 seconds and 13 frames here. So I will simply, whoops, I'll make a group, I'll make an edit. Actually, usually I'll do it in shuffle mode, so it pulls everything else back, and I'll go -313. So I'll put in a marker here just telling me what it is, and then I just go to I just kind of quickly do that, figure out all those changes. Here's another one, for example. This is that right there.
So in other words, you use the dialogue and the sound effects to actually see what has been changed.
Exactly.
And that helps you because it's more visual.
Yeah,
like
it's a super fast way. So here's -122. And I'm not being super careful here. I may have missed stuff, but I'm just demonstrating. But
the beats, you have to make 4/4 into 2/4, or you have to delete a bar.
So I'll do that, and I'll have, okay, -122 here, -313 here, whatever the thing is. And then I'll go into my sequencer, and I'll go, okay, -122 is 5 beats or 5.5 beats. Okay, I need to get rid of 5 beats somewhere in here. And then it's a musical choice. So sometimes you're like, oh, this is just a long sustain. I can trim it easy. Sometimes like, oh my God, I'm in 4/4 and I need to lose 5.5 beats. Crap, I got to make a musical decision. And how do I do that? And sometimes the music's very flowy and I'm like, well, I'll just take a beat out in 5 different bars and make the phrasing go a little bit faster. Sometimes you have to add time. So, okay, I'll just stretch the time. Sometimes it means, well, I'll write more music. So for example, if my music goes da-dee, 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 and I need to add, 4 more beats, well, I could go da-dee, 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 da-dee. That's one approach. I could do a repeat, da-dee, 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 da-dee. Do you know what I mean? That's a perfectly valid approach. Or maybe it makes sense to just stretch it. So instead of da-dee, 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 da, it's da-dee, 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 something like that. So those are all musical choices that, I'm sorry, I can't really help you with. You have to figure out what makes sense for you as a composer. As a music editor, I learn my composer's preferences. So I know that I have composers that don't like to add stuff. They like to stretch stuff or compress stuff, and the same goes in the reverse. When I worked with Danny Elfman, on Oz the Great and Powerful, the main theme was, bum, bum, ba, da, ba, bum, ba, ba, bum, 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 bum. He didn't want to change that ever. So if we needed to stretch it, bum, beam, bum, 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 you just changed it rhythmically and stretched it. If you needed to speed it up, it might be bum, beam, ba da da dum, or but that's his style. He doesn't like to change the melody or the shape. He likes to change the rhythmic value of it. I have other composer that will just like, oh, well, let me just keep going, bum, beam, ba da da dum, da 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 dum, da 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 dum, if they need to stretch it or whatever. Please forgive the terrible singing. So those are creative choices that are up to you. But in terms of figuring out what needs to be done technically, I need this many beats taken away or added. That's how I do it. I go in Pro Tools, like I said, like I showed you here. I just use the guide tracks to help me very quickly find what it is, make the cuts. I put in markers to make quick notes of what it is. So then when I go back to update my spotting notes, and by the way, when I do this, I don't, this bottom track is my demo, it's the music. So it's cutting the music with it. So when I'm done, I can simply go, oh, there's the new start point. Or sorry, the cue behind it. There's the new start point. Now I know what the new start point is without having to work really hard to find it, because just everything moved. So it's automatically where it belongs. Does that make sense? And the same for the end point. I can just, once I've done the conform, I can see where does it end now. And so it's very quick, or relatively quick, to find the new ins, the new outs, and what happened internally. And then I can bring it into my DAW and just do little tweaks. And I'm constantly, basically, it's extremely rare where something, when they lift something, it's like, I need to lose exactly 4 beats. It's never that. It's 4 beats and a few frames or whatever. Well, look at the rest of the hits and what happens. Do those few frames matter? If they do, I'll do a little tempo tweak. If they don't, I'll leave it, because it doesn't matter. It all depends, if it's big action music and there are a lot of hits and they're very specific hits, if it's very rhythmic, or if I'm shooting for a picture cut, it has to be dead on the cut because it's a dramatic moment, then I'll do a tempo tweak to make sure that that hit that happens will still happen dead on the cut. But if it's dialogue and it's flowy music to help the drama of the dialogue, for example, does it really matter if the chord changed here or 3 frames, 4 frames later? Who cares? Do you see what I mean? So those are all choices that are made on a, per case basis. The music and the picture and the situation kind of informs what the solution will be. Which now you've made me already go over conforming to picture changes, which was one of the big questions I was asked.
Thank you so much. This was awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, and if anybody, and by the way, if I'm doing it with audio, I will also show you, for example, we just made 2 cuts here in the audio. This is from a movie that Pinar scored for a Chinese market not long ago that I worked on, and it's already out, so I think it's probably okay. But so here is, whoops, let me just solo this track. And let's see what mess I made of it, and we'll figure out how to fix it. So the music goes something like this. Okay, so I don't know if you heard the glitch, but once the rhythm started, the cut happened right after the rhythmic stuff started. So what my instinct tells me is just pull this out a little bit and see what happened before. Okay. So I don't want to show picture because I'm worried, I don't have the rights to the picture or anything. So what I would do though is open up the picture and see what hits are important. But let's pretend that where this crescendo ends is perfect, and where this rhythmic stuff starts is perfect. So now how do I fix this area here? And another glitch there. So how would I fix that? Well, the first thing I would do is get it back in time. So I'm just going to blow this away. So I can take a couple of beats out there because it's just a held note over, the digga-digga-digga-digga, and throw a little fade there. I'm doing this super fast and rough, but and you can just keep doing that and shorten it if you need to. Oops, and press the wrong button. Shorten a little bit more, kind of play with it, see what it sounds like. And I just keep doing that. Okay, and now I have that big build. All right, it's slightly out of time, so I'll do a little tweak there. And boom, done. So that's how I do it with audio. If I had to do it with MIDI, I just basically do the same thing with the MIDI. Figure out, oh, I have this really long note over here that I can shorten. I have this big crescendo build into a cluster. I can abbreviate that. I can shorten that and make the cluster grow faster. Still get the same effect. Still keep the integrity of the music. Still keep the shape of the music. But now it fits picture again. Good, bad, ugly? I'm fired?
Very good. Very good. You're awesome. Very good.
So yeah, let's see. Another thing I was asked to talk about was the relationship between music and sound design. I don't remember who asked that. Is that person here? Somebody asked.
I am. It's Angela.
Hi, Angela.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good.
So the relationship between, I'm going to talk about the relationship between music and sound in general, because when you end up on the mix stage, basically everything, you can think of everything as frequency. And everything is competing for real estate within the allotted frequency. So when you think about that, it's like you've got low end, mid range, higher end. And you have space. So you have your left channel, center, right, your surrounds. If you're in Atmos, even more control. So you have space and you have frequency. And everything is a competition for real estate. How does it fit? So if you have, I don't know, if you're scoring the Star Trek Enterprise and the ship has this low hum that's just part of the ship, it's part of the sound of the ship, I wouldn't write for instruments that live in those frequencies. Leave it alone, or do so very sparingly, or do it when we're not on the ship, because they're going to fight for the same real estate. And guess what? The sound of the ship's going to win, because it's the freaking Enterprise. If there's a big explosion, one of my pet peeves is when people do action cues and there's a big explosion and they have a huge bang, crash, boom, wallop right on the explosion. Everything builds up to the explosion, cymbals, you know, percussion, everything is just massive. And then you get to the dub stage and it's gone. It gets obliterated. I'm a much bigger fan of or whatever it is. Make a whole, you know, because then you can be so much more effective when you consider those things. And I am a huge fan of spotting with the sound supervisors. I'm a huge fan of doing sound and music spotting together. It doesn't always happen. It happens, I'd say, less frequently than I would like. Sorry, something just popped up. Most often the two are separate, but I try to have conversations with my sound designers. So there's times where specifically sound design, which is very subjective and they actually make stuff up. Often it's very, very tonal. Well, I'll check in with the sound designer especially when I'm writing, but even when I'm the music editor, to look out for my composer. And if they haven't done a certain area and I know that there's going to be sound design, I'll go, hey, do you have a sound design update for us that we can get? Can you send me an updated guide track? And then I can send that to my composer, or when I'm writing, I can address it. Or sometimes I will have done something and then they do their sound design independently, and then I get it and I go, ooh, those really don't play nice. Anyway, so I'll figure out what needs to be done to it. And I'll be literally like, any way you can pitch this down a minor third. Any chance you can pitch this up a half step. So I'll figure out musically what needs to be done to it. And I've never once had anybody say no, ever in my experience, because it makes everything better and they play nice. And it's better to figure these things out before you hit the dub stage than on the dub stage. So it's all about figuring out how things play together. If you have a big action scene and you're on a Michael Bay movie and there's lots of cars flying and crashing and lots of hits, and there's lots of percussive sounds in the nature of the scene, you know, having your big boom, it's going to get buried. It's not going to be helpful. So you might be better off only having those big bangs where you need them. You can keep some of the higher end that cuts more. So you feel that. You can have it in the music, in the pulse, in the synths, in the strings, you know, you can do all of that, but don't have your taiko drums blasting away when you have so many things that are happening that fight with those sounds anyway, because you're going to lose, because it's not helping. Or everything's going to be in there and it'll be muddy. And sometimes everybody's like, just more is more. More is not always more. Sometimes it is. But sometimes more just makes it muddy. Yes, Michael?
I suppose it would be a luxury for the composer to have the sound design intact before he starts composing to make those decisions.
Well, correct, because usually that's being, excuse me, usually that's happening simultaneously. But
right.
That's why I said, I like to be in touch with my sound designers, and I like to reach out if I'm composing and I know there's a sound designer. I like to reach out and introduce myself and say, hey man, if you're doing anything tonal, will you send it to me? Or if I'm working on a scene and I know it's going to be a sound design heavy scene, I may call the sound designer or shoot him an email and go, hey man, I'm about to start on this scene. Have you done anything on this yet? Can you send it to me? And if they haven't, I'm like, great. Then I got here first. I'm going to do my thing. And then I'll send it to them so that when they do it, they're keeping me in mind. And I found that as creatives, we like collaboration. It's kind of in our nature. So I have found that when I do stuff like that, they're usually super open to it and super happy to do it. And I've had people reach out to me. I remember when I did The Wolfman, there are 3 places in the movie where he does the full-on guttural, massive howl. And it starts like really, really low and goes really high and big and massive. And there was a cue where, again, everything had been conformed a gazillion times. And the sound supervisor came over to me and says, you know, the music's kind of stepping over the beginning of that guttural, deep thing, you know. And to his credit, he was brilliant enough to not say, we're just going to lower it or ask the mixer to lower it. He came to me and said, can you possibly move it so that this thing happens earlier and then we're clear and then this thing happens after? He asked me to build him a hole very specifically, and I could build a hole. So I was like, sure, I'd love to. And I did. And it worked great because you get this howl and then the music, and it's like, oh my God, double whammy. Where if they're fighting, it's just mess or not as effective. So my take is always have open conversations. I remember I did this movie called 9. It was an animated film and about these puppet things that, and they accidentally turn on this evil factory. And we were trying to figure out what to do with the factory and make it big. And Debbie Lurie scored it. Danny Elfman did themes, and I was the music butcher. And I remember we were trying to figure out how to deal with this factory. And I'm like, these things are going to be big and clunky. And so I figured out a tempo map of the ones we see on camera, and then we go outside and we no longer see them on camera, but we still hear them from the outside, inside. So I figured out a tempo map for Debbie, and we had this discussion during spotting, and I can't remember if it was her idea or my idea or the director's, whoever, it doesn't matter whose idea it was. But we decided we're gonna match the tempo, and the music's not gonna have any percussion in it. It'll have pulse, it'll have beat, but no percussion. And the sound designer / sound supervisor, Will Files, created all of these sounds to create the pistons. And I sent him the cue when it was ready so that when it's off camera, he could cut everything to the cue, to the music. And he went so far as to say, you know what, when you get up to Skywalker to mix this, I'm just gonna hand you all my elements, and you can pick and choose which elements you like for the sound of the pistons. So he literally gave me like, here's 12, 15 tracks. He's like, we don't need all of them. There's different things. And I picked, oh, I like these for the high end. I like these for the low end. I like this for the middle. Oh, I love this ratchety thing, whatever. So he gave me a bunch of stuff. I picked what it was. I said, are you good with this combo? He's like, well, I kind of missed that one. Can we incorporate that? Yeah. We worked together to decide which elements are going to make up the actual sound of the pistons. And then I sat and cut them to the music. So that when we're inside and they're no longer after, they're dead onto the music. And you have the percussion without having percussion. I love that. It's so much fun when we work together like that. And I've been very fortunate that, like I said, without exception, every single sound supervisor or sound designer I've ever reached out to, they're always happy to collaborate and to do stuff. And often it can go even farther because you'll have an idea or you'll want something and then you'll send it to them and they'll have an idea and they send something back and you're like, oh, this is so cool. I'm going to add a synth that totally takes off from this and then does that. Or I'm going to actually change this because I think then it'll lead into that. And then you send it back to them. They're like, ooh, well, then I'm going to add this or I'm going to change that. And sometimes it goes around and around 2 or 3 times to end up where it ends. And to me, that's super exciting and fun. I love it. I love it. But I think the answer is rather than wait for the dub stage and fight it out, have conversations, invite them in. So I think that's covered all the things that people asked me to cover ahead of time. So I'll open it up to questions if anybody has any other questions. Amit, and then we'll go to Scott next.
Hi. To compose, I noticed that lots of the composers that you work with, you work on several projects. Do they often bring you along to the production, or are you hired from the producers or directors?
All of the above.
Okay, thanks.
It depends. Look, if you're an A-list composer, if you're Danny Elfman, and if Danny says he wants me on the project, then they call me. I mean, Bill Abbott is his go-to guy. I've done about 20 films with Danny, but I've always been his other guy, not his main guy. So I was brought in, I started as an assistant music editor, then I became an additional music editor, and then I was his music editor on a bunch of projects, usually because, not because he was on multiple projects, but rather there was an overlap. So while a big project was finishing and Bill was still finishing a dub, he needed somebody because the next project was starting, right? So I would get calls on stuff like that. You know, it depends on the circumstance and the situation, but if you're a composer and they have a budget for a music editor and they don't have a music editor, try to bring in your own music editor. You want an ally and you want somebody that you can trust, that you have a relationship with, or if you don't, you can build a relationship with, versus being with their guy. Because there's nothing wrong with their guy or woman. Sorry, I don't mean to be, you know, but if you're brought in from the project and then the composer comes in, there might be this feeling, I'm not like that, so I don't have that problem. But I've seen people, I've had conversations with people go, well, their music editor isn't really taking care of my needs. And on bigger projects, sometimes there's more than one music editor. And I've been brought in to be, somebody else is doing the temp or the songs, or the temp and the songs. And then I'm just dealing with score. I've had situations like that. And I've had conversations with the composers like, yeah, I don't trust their person, or their person isn't on my side, or I don't know this person, I know you. So if you can bring in your own person, I highly recommend it. If you don't have a person, I know a guy. But you know, it's a relationship thing. But I've been on projects, you know, I got brought in as an assistant music editor. A post-production supervisor called me because she had worked with me previously and liked me. And she called me to come assist on this little project called Too Fast, Too Furious. And so I met a music editor by the name of Carl Kaller, who is phenomenal, and became his assistant on that project. And John Singleton was the director. And John and I clicked, and we became very friendly. And a couple of months later, when he did Hustle and Flow that he was producing, he called me. He's like, hey, Shie, I want you to be the music editor on this. And I was like, oh, wow, wait, awesome, amazing. And I checked with Carl. I'm like, Carl, are you okay with this? And he called me, and Carl's like, go for it. Okay, great. And I had worked on nearly every single thing he produced or directed since, until he passed away. And we became friends. We became more than just work relationships. He was almost like a brother to me. I mean, I'd go hang out with him on his boat in the marina and stuff. Like I know his kids. That relationship went to a whole new level that doesn't usually happen. so he would bring me in on projects long before he had a composer. And when we did Rebel for BET, I actually scored a couple of episodes. So he was trying to get Raphael Sadiq, and there were issues. I don't know if it was scheduling or budgets or whatever, but Raphael couldn't do the first few episodes, so he let me do them. Super cool. So sometimes I've had that. I've had picture editors call me and say, hey, we need a music editor. Picture editor recommends me. I come in for a meeting. I get the gig. I meet a composer. And years later, that composer and I are still friends. John Swihart and I have become really good friends. He's one of my best friends in LA. I met him because the director of an indie that he scored brought me in. Somebody recommended me to that director on a previous film. He liked me on the previous film, so he brought me onto this film before he even hired John. And then when he brought John in, he's like, John, I already have a music editor. We met. And I've done, I don't know how many projects with John Swihart since. And, you know, so you never know where it comes from. And I think the same is true as a composer. I've been hired by producers, by directors. I've been recommended by fellow composers. I've been recommended by music editors, picture editors. The more people you know, build relationships, maintain the relationships, the better off you'll be, because you never know where it's going to come from. Scott, you had a question.
Hey, Shie, can you hear me?
Hey, yep.
Do you feel there's ever any clash of perception of you as either composer or sound editor? I was thinking of getting into the sound editing when I came here because my background's editing and I kind of do post-prod sound editing at the moment. But I was kind of advised against going into something like a music editor if I wanted to be a composer, because you would just get known for being the editor guy rather than the composing guy. And I'm wondering, I haven't really thought about this for a while now, actually, since you brought it up this morning. So, I mean, is there a problem there, do you think?
Yeah, sadly, I think that's probably good advice.
Right.
Hollywood loves to pigeonhole, and not just with us, with everybody. If you're a comedic actor, you know, nobody thinks of Jim Carrey as a dramatic actor, even though he can do drama, and he has done some dramas, and he does it very well. But everybody thinks of him as the guy with the goofy face that does crazy, wacky comedies. Robin Williams, still, when I say Robin Williams, people think comedian. He was a brilliant dramatic actor, and he's acted in some brilliant dramas, you know, Awakenings, things like that. So yeah, people like to pigeonhole. Same with directors. Michael Bay is known as the big action director. If Michael Bay wants to go do a period drama tomorrow, I don't know that studios are going to be jumping on it. You know what I mean? Bill Ross is known as a brilliant orchestrator and music director. Conrad Pope, known as a brilliant orchestrator. They're both phenomenal composers. But I think being known as brilliant orchestrators and having had a lot of success there has hurt their composing careers. I've had a lot of success as a music editor, and I think it's hurt my composing career. And I think there's two sides to it, because it's not just everybody else's fault. It's not just perception. But I kind of fell into music editing, and I like music editing, and I love it. It's great. But I started getting calls and I started getting gigs, and it paid my bills.
Yeah.
And in my early days, once I got in the union and started working on bigger projects, it didn't just pay my bills. It paid my bills, and I had play money because I was a single guy living in a studio apartment. I later upgraded to a 1-bedroom apartment and eventually a 2-bedroom apartment. But it's like you're renting an apartment, you're by yourself, your expenses are relatively low. And you're making good money. I kind of got lazy about looking for composing gigs for a few years because the music editing was just happening and it was easy, and people were finding me. I didn't have to work hard to find gigs because I got a bit of a reputation, and especially early in my career, I came in at a time where MAG had pretty much gone extinct, but there were still a lot of people that weren't great in Pro Tools and were struggling with digital. And I knew how to do analog and digital, so I was able to translate analog speak into digital speak for a lot of people and help them. So a lot of them passed me around to their friends like I was their favorite new shiny toy. And it got me a lot of work, and it got me well known in the business pretty quickly, which led to more work. And then, as you've, I'm sure, all experienced, if you do good work, people come back to you.
Mm-hmm.
So people started coming back to me. And when now suddenly, when you only have one person coming back to you, that's fantastic, but it's only one person. Now when there's 3, 4, 5 people coming back to you, yeah, things are good. So I got a little complacent because it was easy and I was busy. I didn't have time to compose. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and I really want to compose more. So I've been making a much more concerted effort in the last few years to also compose. But now I have much higher expenses. I have a beautiful wife. I have 2 amazing kids. I have a bigger house. I have more, you know, we have 2 cars, not just one. There's 4 mouths to feed, not just one, all of that kind of stuff. So it's like, I still got to make a living and cover my expenses. So music editing is still how I make my living, but I've made a much more concerted effort to also try to find composing gigs in addition. And I try to score at least 1 or 2 movies a year and at least a few shorts if I can. You know, and if somebody wants to hire me and pay me enough that I can actually make a living as a composer, I'm all for it. You know, spread the word. I'm in. But yeah, I have people that know me purely as a music editor. I have people that know that I also compose, but they're like, every music editor thinks they're a composer. So sadly, I think it's probably good advice, even though it's kind of bullshit to me. It sucks. You know, I don't agree with it. I don't love it. But everybody experiences it. Directors, actors, you know, cinematographers. There are cinematographers that are known for different things. You know, we're all versatile. We can all do a lot of things. On the flip side, if you're passionate about it, then forgive my language, but screw them. Just do what you want.
Yeah.
You know, there are people who have made it happen. You know, John Ottman is a picture editor and a composer. Granted, he only picture edits for Bryan Singer because he wants to compose more than edit, and him and Bryan have always had that relationship, but he hasn't let that stop him. You know, there have been music editors that transitioned very successfully into composing. You know, Stephen Price, Gravity, boom. It can happen. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's a very real risk and consideration that you will get pigeonholed if you find some success doing it.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Anything else? Nope. Nothing. Yes. Colin?
Hey, Shie.
Hi.
Hi. Sorry if you already answered this. I had to wait for a second. But I was wondering if you talked a little bit about as a music editor, kind of the differences in workflow between working in TV versus working on one of your movies.
Oh, okay. No, I didn't talk about TV versus film. That's a good question. So, TV, like the simplest answer is doing TV is like doing a lot of films on a compressed schedule, and it's recurring. So, I mean, if you're doing a movie of the week type thing or whatever, it's similar, and depending on the budget, it's, you know, it's similar to working on an indie or a low budget studio film. When you're doing TV, sometimes you're doing an episode a week. Often it's not an episode a week. Often there's openings in the schedule, so you might have 2 weeks here and there, or even 3 weeks here and there. Things stretch a little bit. But it's a little bit of a Groundhog Week situation where, especially when things are going, seasons 2, 3, 4, 5, when things kind of get in this groove, Often you're like, every Monday at this time we get together and we spot the next episode. And then every Wednesday, Thursday we mix. So I'm going to get the delivery of the previous episode on Tuesday night or sometimes super early Wednesday morning. And so the schedule can be very consistent. So you kind of know, this is happening, and it happens at an accelerated rate because you're just doing it faster. There's not as much messing around with it. With some, the schedule's not quite as concrete, so it's just figuring out the schedule and, again, hitting your deadlines. But the big difference with TV is that you're always working on multiple episodes, because you may have spotted episode 3 while the composer's still working on episode 2 and you're mixing episode 1. Do you know what I mean? They're in different parts of the process, and that can overlap. So you're usually working on 2 or 3 episodes simultaneously in different parts of the process. And I've had days where I'm on a scoring stage one day on an episode and on the dub stage the next day on a different episode. So that can be a little bit of a, mess with your mind a little bit. It's just juggling a little bit more. But other than that, they're very similar. You're still spotting, you're still coming up with music. In TV, the picture editors tend to temp. I don't get asked to temp as much for TV, or usually when I do, it's, can you help us with a scene? Can you help us with this area, rather than temp the whole thing? But other than that, it's kind of the same, just accelerated. Anything else? Anyone else?
Mind if I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess with the whole TV thing, do you find your role shifts from season 1 or the first few episodes versus, let's say you're on a show for, on the 4th or 5th season, do you find your role changes, or is it typically kind of the same from beginning to end?
It's more or less the same. The difference is that when you're starting out, you're finding your way, you're finding the vibe of the show, you're finding the sound of the show, you're finding your footing. And if you watch any show that's had several seasons, look at the pilot, look at the first few episodes, and then look at season 5, and you're like, whoa, they've really come a long way. You don't notice it because it's incremental usually as it's happening. Although with some shows, it's very dramatic. Like with The Good Wife and The Good Fight that David Buckley does, every once in a while, his producers like to shake it up, and suddenly new season, you're like, what, did they get a completely new composer? Nope, still David, but they've decided to do it a whole new different way. So that can sometimes happen. But usually you work out the kinks and you figure out the workflow and the personalities and how everybody likes to work within the first few episodes, and then it becomes kind of smooth sailing. Anyone else have anything?
Yeah, actually, I have a question.
Yeah,
Magnus
hi.
here. Hi.
Oh.
I just wonder if you're working with templates, and if yes, if they are different for the director, for the project, or even the composer, or the genre. So
as a music editor, I do not have a template because it all depends on what I'm getting from the composer, from songs, from whatever the project needs, and I'll find out. On a TV show, first episode, I'll find out what does the stage expect, and whatever they expect, that's their template. So when I did Krypton, for example, Todd Grace was like, this is my template. I have this many tracks. I do it like this. This is how I want it set up. Great, that's my template. And if Pinar gave me too many tracks, I would have to figure out how to deal with it and how to make it work. So then, I'm on a template. And the same like Blake Neely with his TV shows. I don't know if he does the same template for all of his shows. He might. But certainly when I did Arrow with him for a couple of years, there was a template for Arrow, and that's how it came in. And the stage had a template, and they matched, and you work with that. But one project can look completely different than another. You know what I mean? Especially in film, or one TV show can look completely different than a different TV show. As a composer, yes, I have a template. I have a very extensive template. If you want, I can pull it up and show you. You want me to do that?
All right, yeah. I mean,
Sure.
the
So
question was more about the sound editing. If you just have the template with all the reference tracks and then just put everything on the already existing tracks, or if you
now, as a
start
music editor, I
from
build
scratch.
it as I go, depending on what I get. And like
Yeah,
I said,
okay.
a lot of it is conversations with the dub stage. What are they expecting? So with a low budget film, often they're on smaller stages or in smaller, more limited facilities, and they might go, we can take 16 stereo tracks, that's our limit, you know, because they import the tracks into a bigger master session, where if I'm at Warner Brothers, stage 9 or 10, it's on a completely separate rig. I just bring a hard drive with my session, open it up. I can give them 500 tracks if I wanted to. They can handle it. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it depends on the circumstance. If I'm working on something like Hustle and Flow, where there's a ton of songs and not that much score, my template's going to look very different than if I'm working on Jurassic Park.
For sure.
You
Yeah.
know what I mean? But here is, let me open my Cubase template if you're curious.
Yeah, thanks.
And hold on. And I find that this is very helpful for me, just to have everything at my fingertips. Sorry, it's just loading. It takes a few seconds. I'll put it over on this screen so you guys can see it on the bigger screen. So as you can see, as it opens up, I've got folders and colors, and the piano is the only sound that's open. I don't use VEP. I used to. I have a fast enough and strong enough computer now with lots of cores that I prefer to just do everything internally and not have to connect to other things. I find it to be simpler. So I simply have everything disabled. So here is a different piano, and if I want this piano, I will simply enable it. And now I have that piano. And the way I'm set up is I have some folders and some subfolders. Whoops. So I like to have it sort of in orchestra order. So woodwinds, brass, strings, mixed orchestral effects, ethnic strings, strummed, vox for vocal stuff, keys, harp, mallets, bells, percussion, drums, loops, synth, pulses, basses, and extra. And you can see they're all color-coded. Those are my stems. So when I print, or here, I'll open my mixer. So you can see there are my stems that everything goes to, and they all match the colors, and then everything goes to my stereo mix. And whenever I open something, you see I have, these are my two pianos that are currently open, so they're going to keys. So I don't even have to think about it. Everything's pre-wired. Does that make sense? And then I'll go back to this for you. So within every folder, I'll have the individual instruments, then effects. I like to group them and keep them close because I don't use them that often. Saxophones are kind of a specialty, so I have them in their own folder. Recorders are kind of a specialty, so I have them in their own folders. And then I have an audio folder everywhere. Every stem, I have an audio folder. So if I'm recording live instruments, or if I want to bounce something to do some audio processing to it, I have tracks ready to go. And everything's, all the outputs are already preset, so I don't have to think about it. Another thing I do with everything is, you'll notice at the bottom here, I have these 4 empty contacts. So if I want to load a sound, a new woodwind sound that I didn't think about, I don't have to create a new contact instrument and route it and all of that. It's ready to go. All I have to do is enable it and, whoops, go find my sound. You see what I mean? And I do the same with everything. So there's my woodwinds, the brass, same idea. There's all my brass effects are in a folder, brass audio, and you can see here I've got these 4 empty ones. I don't know why I have 4. 1 is enough because if I need more, I can just duplicate it almost instantly. And there's another and another and another. You know, it's so fast. Strings, same idea, string effects. I like my solos separate. Solo string effects are inside solo strings. So it just helps me keep things organized. For strummed, I have my different guitars. So I have acoustic guitars, 12 strings, nylons, mountain dulcimers, and then other stuff that's kind of my go-tos. For vocals, I have my handful of choirs, then I have all my instances of exhale, for example. So I don't have to think about, oh, I want to load exhale and find a sound. It's just exhale, boom, go. Keys and harps, I've got my pianos, I've got my prepared pianos, which those aren't effects, you know, like creepy banging on pianos, but those are things like felt pianos, or I've got these Pripyat pianos that are kind of wonky sounding pianos or whatever. So it's just different harmonic pianos, plucked pianos, things like that. And then I have my piano effects, which is my like prepared piano, bang, clang, weird, creepy stuff. And then I've got other keys where I have some things that are kind of go-tos that I like to use a lot. Electric pianos and organs, harps, accordions, and then my extras and my audio. Then I've got my mallets, and you'll notice the mallets are the same color as keys. So for stemming, I put keys and mallets together. Because usually I don't have both at the same time. And even if I do, they make sense because they're melodic percussion. Pianos are a percussion instrument. It's a pitched percussion instrument. And my bells, same thing, so same stem. For percussion, I've got my orchestral percussion, my big percussion, my other percussion, electronic percussion, and metals, and then my audio. And then for synths, this is really a little bit crazy, but I've got all my contacts, but then I have a bunch of absynths, a bunch of FM8s, massive, omnisphere, mystic, prologue, you know, all my different synths all ready to go. And I do the same for pads, and I do the same for pulse. So for synths, I tend to try to put things that are more synth lead type instruments or synth effects. For pads, I tend to do just pads. And for pulse, anything that's on arpeggio or pulsing or, you know, boom, 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 boom. I try to put them there and separate them. I find that helps later in the mix on the dub stage. And I just have all these empty tracks ready to go. So if I want one, again, all I have to do is enable it, find a sound, go. So I don't like, I want this to be as invisible as possible to the creative process. So that's how my template basically works. And then I've got my bass, and then I've got my extra. And the extra can be anything. Sometimes you might have a trumpet-based score where there's a lot of solo trumpet. I'll put the solo trumpet in the extra rather than in the brass because I want it separate from everything else. Does that make sense? So does that answer the question on templates?
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Hey,
Anyone
Shie,
else?
do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
So you can answer briefly. You interface with a lot of directors, and I'm really curious to hear your opinion on how directors' tastes in music, in style, have changed. Because, for instance, what I hear from Daniel very often, oh, the directors just want noodly, indistinct, non-melodic, non-thematic scoring. I know there's a spectrum of tastes, and probably on each end of the spectrum you have the very thematic directors and also the very noodly directors. But in your own perception, if you have to answer the question, how have the directors' tastes in scoring changed, what would you say?
Listen to the majority of film scores, and there's your answer. If you just listen to what film music's coming out, you see what's trending. And film, like every other art, is like fashion. It changes and things go in style. I remember when Hans Zimmer put in those jungle flute samples, those shakuhachi-esque type of things in his scores, and suddenly everybody was using them in every score. And then Michael Kamen put a saxophone in his Lethal Weapon scores, and suddenly there were a million scores with saxophone. And you see that happening. You've seen it happening with like Atticus Ross or Trent Reznor, where they did some of the kind of pulsy, weird, scratchy things, and suddenly that's everywhere. You know what I mean? So a lot of directors, well, I'd say if I had to overgeneralize, I'd say I can think of three sort of types of directors. There's the directors that are like, I miss the old days. I want themes. I want melodies. I want that. You have the directors that say, I want something I've never heard before. And they're always like, I just want something completely different. I want something new. Let's invent a sound. Let's come up. And they really get off on coming up with something new and experimental. And then there's the directors that just kind of go with the trend. And they're like, I just saw, I don't know, I just saw Inception and I love those Brahms. I want those Brahms all over my score. Okay, and now the Brahms are everywhere, And then you get into this argument, did Hans invent them or did somebody else invent them? Or, it's like, who did it first? Who cares? It's like, who wore the turtleneck first? Steve Jobs or John Williams or some professor that came long before either of them? Do you know what I mean? Who cares who did it first? It's meaningless. So yeah, you have the people that just are like, make it like that. Make it like the temp. And when you're temping, they're like, make it like this cool new thing that I just heard. And like I said, that's like fashion. It goes in and out of style. You have the classics, which is your John Williams type stuff. Michael Giacchino, I would put under the more classic composer. His style is very sort of old Hollywood, do you know what I mean? And then you have the more sort of pushing the envelope folks, like the Trent Reznors, et cetera, et cetera. Does that answer the question? Oh.
Yes, perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much. This was incredible. Thank you with all my heart. This was so informative and I really enjoyed it. Awesome work. Awesome job. Thank you.
Well, if there's anybody else, speak now or forever hold your peace.
I would like to ask a question.
Absolutely.
Hi, hello. I would like to ask, I want to reach out for assistant positions.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the idea of maybe approaching several composer agents to kind of build a relationship and to build a network to maybe possibly learn about open positions. I've already experienced as a composer for film, TV, and games, and I've also already gained experience as an assistant, as an additional writer, also for bigger films. And is this idea any good, or is it even an absolute no-go to reach out to agents to possibly get contact to composers for assistant positions or something like that?
If you reach out to agents, I don't think a single agent will give you the contact info of their clients.
Mm-hmm.
I think they will either blow you off, they'll either ignore you, not respond, or they'll respond in some sort of curt, polite, thanks, no thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Or they'll say, let me forward this. I just realized there's a whole chat going on here that I haven't been looking at. I'm sorry. Holy moly. I'll read that later. Sorry. So they'll either do that or they'll say, I'll forward this to my client. And then if the client's interested, they'll get back to you. So there's no harm in trying. I'm a big believer in there's no
Well,
harm in
that
trying
would
anything.
already be pretty nice if
Yeah,
this would happen.
to me, there's never any harm in trying, to me.
Okay, good.
Because
That's
what's the
important.
worst that's going to happen? They're going to blow you off. They're going to say, oh my God, this guy's an idiot. And unless you've done something really exceptionally extraordinary to be memorable as being a complete and total boob, they're going to forget you. And 2 weeks later, they might meet you again in a different circumstance, and they have no idea that you're the guy that they just spoke to. Honest to goodness, one of the second job I got in town, okay? I had just gotten fired from my first job, which is an awesome experience. I highly recommend avoiding it. And I was kind of in a panic, and I hardly knew anybody in town. So I called a couple people I know, and somebody said to me, hey, I just interviewed at this place. They're expanding. Call this guy Frank. I know they're looking for people. I call this guy Frank. I talked to him on the phone. He's like, yeah, man, I have a whole stack of resumes on my desk. I don't need any more. Call me in a month. We're expanding. We're growing. And I was like, well, then let me send you my resume now, and you can hang on to it for a month. Yeah, okay, fine. And he hangs up on me. Literally hangs up in my face. I call back, get the reception. And I'm like, hey, what's your fax number? I get the fax number. This was before cell phones, before emails, or email was new or whatever. I print out a resume. I run down the street 5 blocks or whatever it was to a Kinko's before it was FedEx Kinko's. I fax the thing over. I run home. I call. I go out of breath. I'm like, I just sent you a fax. I just want to make sure it's legible. They're like, yeah, I've got it. I'm like, great. Jim's expecting it. And I swear to God, half an hour later, I get a phone call. Hi, this is Jim from such and such, and I was just looking at your resume, and I like what I've seen. I was wondering if you could come into an interview. I'm like, yes, when? They're like, how fast can you be here? I'm like, an hour. They're like, great, we'll see you in an hour. And I go in, and I have the interview. I drive home. It takes me 25 minutes or something to get home. By the time I get home, there's already a voicemail waiting for me on my answering machine. Hi, this is Jim, and we really liked your interview, and we'd like to offer you the position. Can you start tomorrow? Honest to goodness story. And I'm like, how the hell did this happen? So I start working there. I start getting comfortable. And a month or two in, I'm like, I have to investigate how this happened. So now that I'm in and I'm feeling more confident and I'm not like going to get fired any second, you know, that those first day jitters are over and it's been a while. I start inquiring, and it turns out what happened was very simple. He hung up on me, not a second thought. I went, sent the fax, called the front, you know, the girl at the front desk, said he's expecting the fax. What does she know? Oh, if he's expecting the fax, I'd better go give him the fax. She went. She's like, yeah, I kind of vaguely remember that. I think he wasn't in the room, so I just put it on his desk. There was a stack of resumes. There was a stack of resumes on his desk. She just put mine on top. He came back from, I don't know, peeing or a meeting or doing whatever, took a look at the stack of resumes, looked at the first one and went, oh, wow, this one looks pretty good. Let's call this guy. And I got the gig. So there's no harm in trying, ever. Just try. The worst that will happen is they'll say no. If you don't ask, you've already got the no. You've given it to yourself. My dad, growing up, I was terribly afraid of dating and asking girls out. I still am, which is why I'm never going to divorce my wife, because I'm never going back to dating. And my dad said, all you have to do is ask, and you have a 75% chance of success. I was like, Dad? He's like, no, really, hear me out. Said, in order for it to happen, you need to want it, and she needs to want it. So each one of you is 50%, right? The instant you ask, you've gone the 50%. All that remains is her 50%. Now she'll either say yes or no. So 50% of that, you're you're 75% of the way there just by asking. It's really bad math, but it's a really great way to live. And it's
Thank you
true
for that
anything.
advice.
And it's true
Yeah.
for everything. I did one of those multi-musician video things, and I just wanted to put something out. I had no work when this all started. Right now I have some stuff, but I had nothing. I just wanted to put something out. So I did this thing. I did an arrangement. It ended up being a big orchestral arrangement with choir and singers, and I'm like, okay, this is huge. This is never going to happen, but I'm going to call some friends and see if I can get a few people to sweeten it, and then I'll put out one of those videos with a handful of people. 82 musicians by the time it was done. Blew my mind. Like the response was overwhelming. And so now it's out there. You can go to my YouTube channel or whatever. You can see it, and please see it and spread it and make it go. I hate the phrase go viral. Make it blow up. Make it go global, because it's to help support MPTF and raise funds. So please help the cause. But I had no idea if anybody would be interested. I had no idea if it would work. I had no idea if it would go anywhere. All I did was ask. And it happened, and it blew up beyond my wildest dreams. And then I called my publicist, and I'm not paying my publicist right now. It's like you pay them per project. I was like, hey, will you do me a favor? And, do you have any advice or any tips on helping get this some attention? Because I want to raise money. And she's like, sure, yeah, I like the project. She'll help me out. And she reached out to various media outlets, and it was featured in Deadline Hollywood as part of an article talking about PSAs and other things that Hollywood's doing to raise things. And then Newsweek magazine picked it up. And when I was a kid, I used to subscribe to Newsweek. And as of a week and a half ago, I'm in Newsweek. My freaking headshot is in Newsweek. They did an article about the video and shared it. And then somebody picked it up in Ireland. One of the singers is originally from Ireland, and the Limerick Post did an article about it from her perspective, but I'm mentioned in that article. And then my local newspaper here in Santa Clarita Valley picked it up, and I was on the front page of the local newspaper, which is just mind-boggling. And then I got a call from KCAL9, which I'm assuming they follow up like they said. I'm supposedly going to have an interview with them today about it for KCAL9. I didn't expect any of that. All I did was ask a few friends if they'll play on my little idea to try to put a little love out in the world. And look what happened, Just, yeah, try, ask. The worst is you'll say no. Or if you follow Richard Kraft makes a complete ass out of himself all the time. He doesn't care. He makes a fool out of himself all the time. He doesn't care. Nobody else cares. Actors put themselves out all the time and make complete asses of themselves all the time in order to get the role. People show up in costume for auditions. They show up in character. They do all sorts of crazy things, Pinar, I'm sure we all know the story. I've been working with Pinar for a while now, and she's awesome, but everybody knows, or if you don't, I'll recount it. Her story of getting Captain Marvel. She's a huge fan of superhero movies. She desperately wanted to do a superhero movie. Captain Marvel, being a female-led one, really spoke to her as a female composer. She reached out to her agent and said, how do we reach out to these people? Get me a meeting, get me in the door. And then she kind of was able to barely squeak in the door. She went out on a huge limb, recorded an orchestra, hired people to do a behind-the-scenes video, did this incredible demo, this whole video, spoke to them. It got to the right people. They liked it enough, and were able to convince Marvel and Disney and everybody to take a chance on her. And now she's Pinar Toprak, where before she was just Pinar who? You know what I mean? All because she asked. And for every success story like that, for my success story about this video or that job that I got, I have 100 where I asked and doors slammed in my face. People didn't respond. It didn't work. But I think the secret to success, it's a numbers game. if the numbers say you're only going to make it 1 in 100 times, you got to try 100 times. You got to try 1,000 times, 10,000 times. Do you know what I mean? You just got to keep trying so that it keeps happening. Just embrace no. And by the way, no in this town never means no. It just means not right now under the current circumstances. I've had no's, and 3 weeks later I get a phone call, and that the exact same thing that 3 weeks prior was a no is suddenly a yes. You never know. Don't take it personally. Just, yeah, go for it.
Thank you so much.
Sure. So yeah, anything else? I'm trying to look quickly at all these texts that I didn't realize were going on in the chat. Hello, everybody. Hi from Finland. Hi from London Educational. You're welcome. Any industry standard level mix for dialogue, music, and sound design? Cora, is Cora still here? I don't know. Oh yes, hi. Yes, I don't know the answer. That's for mixers and techie people. I use my ear. I know rooms are typically tuned to 80 dB. So all professional rooms are typically tuned to 80 dB. And I know there's like the standard of -20 is a big standard for music or whatever. Just make it sound good. I mean, if you're doing it yourself, just make it sound the best you know how to make it, and you'll be fine. Once you start working with mixers and people like that, they know what they're doing. You don't need to know the tech stuff unless you really want to. I have no idea. I mean, even on my home setup, I actually hired an engineer friend of mine to come over and help me tweak levels a little bit and stuff of all my groups or my stems and my final output. And here's how I know my level. It's so silly. I'll see if I can show you, but you see this knob here? I don't know if you guys can, let me see. See the knob on my window, and there's a little green mark right there. So I know when I'm mixing, I got to put that there, and that's the level. I don't know what it means, but I know that when I was working with my mixer friend who came to help me, that was, you know, he's like, he looked at the meters and everything and said, this is, you know, I tended to mix a little bit loud. He's like, turn up the volume and then you won't mix as loud. That's it. So yeah, there is, but you don't have to worry about it. How to approach the best way, we just talked about that. I am just the best at explaining all of this. Well, thank you. We could have, okay, this is just comments, which are nice. Thank you for being so interactive. I wish I paid attention to this sooner, sorry. Have another chat coming in with a pal. Okay, bye. Already gone. I don't see any other questions right now. Cool. So if there's any other questions, I guess now is the time. If not, then I'm gonna go downstairs and get some lunch. Anyone, anything?
Thank you, Shie. This was awesome. Really fantastic. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
I will go eat lunch though also.
And I'm easy to find. So if anybody has questions or anything, you know, just go to my website, contact me, Facebook, whatever. Ask anybody. I'm not hard to find, and I will respond to you 100%. If you ever reach out to me and I didn't respond, then I didn't get it. It went into a junk mail that I never noticed, or I don't know what, but I will always respond. Even if the response is, hey, thanks for reaching out. I don't have time for you right now, but I will always respond. So, all right, well, thanks guys. I hope this was helpful. Maybe we'll do another one someday. I don't know. We'll see.
All right.
Thank you so much.